Tonight, we're finally free to travel anywhere, but who can really afford it? The cost of living is biting hard and presenting political challenges as well. And how on earth did a logo for a women's network go so horribly wrong? Welcome to Q&A. Trioli. We're coming to you live from Melbourne tonight, and joining me on the panel, our first international guest in real life in far too long, literary icon Roxane Gay, Victorian Liberal Senator Sarah Henderson, who shares the inquiry into proposed anti-trolling laws, author and Indigenous advocate Thomas Mayer, who's travelled here from Darwin, former New South Wales Government Minister and commentator Prue Goward, and all the way from WA, remember that place? Member for Cowan and Ali. The borders really are open, and it's wonderful to have everyone in the room tonight. Please make our panel welcome. It's feeling like old times. And a little later, we'll bring you a performance live from Living End's Chris Cheney. Remember, you can stream us live on iView and our social channels. Quanda is the hashtag, so please join in the conversation. We publish your comments on screen from Instagram, Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. Now, before we get to our first question, Roxane Gay, it's been more than 2 years since we had someone hop on a plane, a guest from overseas, and actually travel here. Have you lost muscle memory on how to do long-haul travel?
I have not, because I actually traveled quite a lot through the pandemic, long haul for work, for family, and so 6 hours, 14 hours, it's all the same.
It all runs in together. Do you think the rest of the world's forgotten about us because we closed ourselves off for so long? Will we ever get them back?
Oh, you'll get them back. I think that lots of places had to close themselves off from the rest of the world, and a lot of people are trying to figure out what travel looks like in this new normal. But people love to travel and love to explore new places, and I don't think that a virus is ever going to get rid of curiosity.
Nice to know. We've got a few questions on that tonight, but our first question comes from Sophie Nash.
Australia is in a cost of living crisis. The experience of many young people and students like myself is that for their entire adult life, they've faced unaffordable housing, expensive supermarket bills, and insecure work. While yes, now petrol prices are exorbitant and it hurts, that's not the full story. My question is to Anna Lee and Sarah Henderson. Why have governments failed for so long to address the cost of living for young people?
Sarah Henderson, let's start with you. You're sitting in the seat of government, and it's to both sides of politics.
Virginia, well, thank you for a great question. Look, there are certainly some cost of living pressures at the moment, particularly with petrol. There's no doubt about that, but the fundamentals of our economy are very strong. So we've just today seen unemployment drop to 4%. Unemployment for women is actually 3.8%. We've seen a very substantial jobs growth, another 375,000 jobs created since before the pandemic. And of course, we're seeing wages increase as well. So the fundamentals are strong, but there are still pressures, there's no doubt about it, and we are very focused on those pressures. Housing, I think, is a particular issue. I know from where I come from in the Geelong region, even people seeking to rent are really actually starting to struggle. So that's, I know, and I hope will be a particular focus in the budget, along with cost of living pressures. And I hope that, I'm sure Josh Frydenberg is watching tonight. I don't have any particular insights, but I hope and I trust that cost of living pressures will be addressed in the budget.
But to go to the question, why have both sides of politics not made life in this very lucky country of ours more affordable for young people?
Well, I don't really accept that, because if you look, for instance, at unemployment, we're almost at full employment. So it's actually...
The measure for full employment, now without getting lost in the weeds, the measure for full employment is pretty low these days.
Sure, but there are many employers at the moment desperately looking for young people to employ, and we've actually seen really strong numbers for youth unemployment. That's dropped quite dramatically. So, as I say, the fundamentals are very strong, and our plan, Virginia, is all about continuing to grow a strong economy, driving those jobs, driving a stronger economy, and make sure that through, for instance, our tax cuts have delivered some $30 billion into the pockets of 11 million taxpayers. So we want to make sure that more money stays in Australians' pockets, and I think that's part of the issue with Labor. Labor, as we know, the last election...
We'll get to Labor. The question actually was to Anne Ali as well.
Higher taxes is an issue and is a particular concern.
And Ali, the question was to your side of politics, and it skews both of you, that you've not done enough to actually make life more affordable in this country.
I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Sophie, thank you for the question, Sophie. And Sarah, I appreciate all the statistics and the numbers that you put out there, but none of those statistics and none of those numbers mean anything to Sophie or to anyone out there who's struggling at the moment to make ends meet. And the fact is that prices are going up, whether it's a box of tissues, whether it's food, and whether it's indeed petrol. And of course, some of those pressures come from global events that are unforeseeable, and that would present a challenge to any government. But let's not kid ourselves that everything is hunky-dory. It's not hunky-dory, and it's certainly not hunky-dory for young people like Sophie. It's certainly not hunky-dory for many of the people in the community of Cowan when I go out and I knock on doors. If you want to know the story, if you want to know the impact, don't give me figures. Don't give me percentages and numbers. Look at the faces of the people who have to put half their shopping back at the counter because they can't afford to pay it.
Well, let's get to the question. So what has Labor done that's actually addressed that?
So
because
there are a
Sophie's
number of
saying that you
things.
haven't.
Well, we're in opposition, Sophie, I think you know.
But when
that.
you're in government,
But, and I'm getting to that now, Virginia. So there are a number of things. The first thing, there are a number of other ways to reduce the pressures on the household budget. One of the ways that Labor is proposing is, of course, childcare, making childcare more affordable. I know, as a young, single, working mum, rushing to pick up my children from childcare meant that I couldn't take on any more hours and earning a minimum wage. And that meant the difference between being able to put food on the table one week and then not another week. So childcare is one. Good, secure jobs is another one. And the key to that is productivity. And we have a plan for productivity. And the third one is taking pressure off utilities and electricity prices by investing in renewables and making them more affordable.
OK, let me get to the rest of the panel and I may come back to you if there's time. Prue Goward, what's been the policy failure here?
Well, of course, youth unemployment has always been very high for people who aren't students. It's been as high as 33%, and in some regional communities it's still very high. I actually think the failure is the lack of options for young people. If you don't go to university in Australia, your job options are insecure, unskilled work. And we've had 2 years of a pandemic where you haven't had people coming in, but that is now going to change. And Sophie, those pressures are going to be back on the young, unskilled job market. But what about the technical trade sector? I mean, we have done a disgraceful job as a series of state governments, I think, in technical education. We've been always slow off the mark, very difficult to get proper apprenticeships. That's where the opportunities are for kids who don't want to go to university for a whole lot of reasons. And I think we should have done a lot better in upskilling those kids, and we didn't do it. And
let me turn to Thomas. Thomas Mayor, what do you think? What do you think the policy failure has been here?
Well, I think successive governments have failed because basically there's been this experiment of trickle-down economics that has obviously failed. I mean, generation after generation, we've just seen richer get richer and the poorer get much poorer. Even through the pandemic, we saw billionaires make a whole heap more money while other people were desperate. And I think the big thing that we need to consider here is that we have, ever since the coalition government has gotten in, there's been this attack on workers' rights. We've seen wages stagnate for that reason. And, to take away the ability for workers to collectivise, to build power, to be able to negotiate with big employers, that is so important to the whole economy. This isn't just about workers versus business or anything. This is actually, it's all connected. when workers are paid well, when they're happy, when they've got secure jobs and aren't doing casual work, doing 3 jobs and still struggling to make ends meet, then that's not good for anybody in this country.
To put in context, of course, what you do, you're an MUA union organiser and also a member of the Labor Party, so you come at it from that particular perspective, just so we understand that. But Roxane, are these similar discussions that are being had back in your home country, particularly for a younger generation?
Absolutely, and there are a lot of young people educated and ready to join the workforce, but who are not willing to work for unreasonably low wages and very few benefits. And so, yes, unemployment may well be at 4% here, and I think the unemployment rate in the United States is quite similar. But when people are clamoring to find people to fill jobs, it's not because no one wants to work, it's because they're being offered really untenable working situations with not enough money, nothing to fall back on, and in the United States, we don't have universal health care. And so most Americans are one unfortunate illness away from bankruptcy, and that's no way to live. And so we have to start to tax the wealthy appropriately. And until you do that, there will never be enough money for anyone to thrive, because billionaires are indeed getting far wealthier. And capitalism is great, it serves me well. But I think that, I mean, it's like, let's just be honest.
And the options aren't great.
But yeah, there are very few things that people who don't luck into money can do. And so we have to do more than offer them policy ideas. We have to start to tax the rich.
Just before we get to, I've got a question coming up on petrol, which is, as we all discussed before, a real pressure point. But just quickly, just to go back to our 2 politicians here, housing affordability in Australia now is now among the worst in the world. We all saw that international survey come out today. Our major cities are in the top 20 unaffordable cities in the world. But neither of your parties are prepared to touch the perk of negative gearing, which allows some Australians to fund investments thanks to the taxpayer, therefore making houses even more unaffordable, neither side. So I just wonder if either of you want to look Sophie in the eye this evening and tell her that she should be happy about that policy. Anne?
Well, we had
Should
the
she be
policy.
happy?
We took the policy to the 2019 election and it was
You
rejected.
are not taking it to the next election and you know it, you've scrapped
Yeah.
it. So tell her to be happy about it.
No, don't be happy about it, Sophie. Don't be happy about it. Oh, look,
So should she vote for you if she's not happy about it?
Well, yeah, you should still vote for me. Don't put me on the spot there, Virginia.
We're coming up to an election, Anne Ali. This is where we live right now.
I agree with you. I thought it was a good policy, and I thought that we had good policies for housing affordability.
So you wish the policy
Unfortunately, it was all
stay.
misconstrued, and it was all put out there, and there was a whole lot of misinformation and disinformation put out there about Labor's policies. But we had the right policy settings to improve housing affordability. I want to tell you, we see you. I see you, right? I know what it's like to be young and to be on a fixed income and to struggle.
Well, let me ask Sarah Henderson. You're going to have to justify it to Sophie this evening, because that's one of the reasons that young people can't afford houses.
Well, Virginia and Sophie, and to all young Australians, I've been really proud to see the way the Morrison government has helped so many young Australians into housing.
Hey, we're going to let people talk tonight, OK? I think it's really important. We hear different views that you don't agree with, OK?
Yeah, we've got a number of really important schemes, including the First Home Buyers Scheme. We've actually assisted some 320,000 Australians into home ownership, including single parents, where we're offering a scheme where people
The point
can
was about
buy...
negative gearing, though, Sarah Henderson.
Yeah, no, well, we have rejected that because we believe that it's a tax on housing. What we want to see, Virginia, is more young Australians getting into their own home, and that's why we've provided such strong support, whether it be Home Builder, whether it be the First Home Deposit Scheme, whether it be even accessing super, which now you can use your super to purchase a home. And of course also, never before until the Morrison government have we seen the support for sole parents getting into their own homes. So it's an issue that we take seriously. As I mentioned before, Virginia, it's one that does concern me. There certainly are pressures on young people getting into homes, but it is one that we take very seriously, and you can see the action on the ground.
Sophie, just very quickly, if you can.
I think one of the issues is, how do you ever, if the cost of living is so high, how do you ever save for a deposit to buy a house?
I'm going to... And in the tradition of Q&A, we'll take that as a comment. Our next question comes from Ross Kroger.
Living and driving in Senator Henderson's area, the cost of fuel exceeds $2 a litre, adding hundreds of dollars to the annual bill. Another blow to tourism for small townships across all Victoria and every rural resident not in Melbourne. Simple day trips and holidays are unaffordable. What is the answer?
Before we get to our politicians, Goward, do you have a theory on what the answer is here? I mean, we've seen, a cut to the fuel excise in the past before.
Yes, and we saw how well that went, not. So I'm not sure that that's the answer, but I mean, we are teetering. I mean, Europe is teetering on war, and my parents, I mean, petrol rationing only stopped in Australia in 1950.
Do you think that's on the cards, petrol rationing?
Well, I'm not sure that petrol rationing is. I'm just making the point that war has an enormous economic impact, which is why it's been so courageous that the West is prepared to bear this cost in order to contain Mr. Putin's advances. It could go on for months. We don't know whether Ukraine will pull back and this will all be over and done in 2 weeks, or whether this will continue. But what we do know is that war is terribly expensive. It has a shocking impact on young generations, particularly. And what we are all experiencing, I mean, I hear your pain. I live in a country town. Petrol is a huge cost to all of us. That this is the price of war, and this is why we must be so vigilant. This is why we must stare down people like this, or the world is overwhelmed by bad actors and totalitarian states who defy democracies.
So
because we don't
it's simply
have the
the price we pay.
I'm afraid. I mean, the history of the world is that, Virginia.
Okay.
The First World War, the Second World War.
Let me go to Thomas Mayer on this.
Oh, look, there's no doubt that that's an effect, but I think there's been a massive lack of vision from governments for so long about fuel security. I mean, our seafarers, Australian seafarers, sailed on ships carrying fuel, and they've all lost their jobs because, foreign flags ships have taken over their jobs. There's only about 2 weeks fuel supply in this country. Should the supply be blocked, It's a huge lack of vision. I'm a Torres Strait Islander, and this is really affecting remote communities as much as any communities, absolutely more.
Can you give us an example of how in particular?
Well, we've always had high costs in remote communities.
Yeah.
And our fuel has always cost a lot, but now our fuel is costing so much that, to get from island to island in the Torres Strait, it's almost becoming, unaffordable. To go and get the fresh produce that we can't afford in the shops is becoming much more difficult because fuel costs so much. But I think the other real lack of vision goes to, that this country should have been well ahead of using fossil fuels in our cars. We should have the infrastructure throughout the whole country and be using electric vehicles.
Well,
we
certainly
should be there.
an incentive to electric cars, I agree.
Roxane, fuel prices are soaring in the US too, yes?
Yes, my wife and I live in Los Angeles and New York, and in LA the other day when we got home, the gas was $7 a gallon. And it's outrageous, but it is what it is. And the reason I think so many people are suffering is because of the West's refusal to adapt and develop renewable energies sufficiently, public transportation, infrastructure, electric cars, which are not going to be the magical solution. Really, it is public transportation that will solve many of these problems. But until we decouple dependence on oil from the economy, we are not really going to see lower gas prices. And unfortunately, it is the working class and the poor who are disproportionately bearing the brunt of the costs of this. For many people, you can absorb the costs, but what about those who can't?
Do you think a cut to the fuel excise, Sarah Henderson, is inevitable?
Well, Virginia, let me firstly say there's no doubt that this is driven, the cost of petrol at the moment has been driven primarily by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that's placing enormous pressure on global oil prices. And in part I agree with Thomas, because historically Australia hasn't tackled the fuel security issue, but in recent years we've now introduced a fuel security package, and it's something that we've taken very seriously. And to the point about investing in other forms of fuel, I was down at the Geelong refinery a couple of weeks ago where we announced a $20 million grant to set up the country's first hydrogen refuelling facility for diesel trucks. So it is a challenge that we are tackling very seriously. We've got a $260 million investment in diesel storage. I know that the Minister has announced that we'll be looking to release 1.7 million barrels, which is stored through the US as part of our fuel security. So this is something that is a serious issue, but I do have to stress that this is an issue that the Morrison government has taken very, very seriously. As for the excise, I don't know what's planned in the budget. I sort of have
we'll wrap it up quickly.
Yeah, have similar concerns to Prue, in that that money is being used to obviously fund roads and regional infrastructure and the like, and it may only be a short-term fix. So
prices have raced past the excise cut before in the past, famously when John Howard did it.
That's right.
Let's go to our next question. It comes from Isabella Curry.
Like many others, I unsubscribed from my Spotify premium account following the Joe Rogan controversy. I made this decision as someone who understands the harm and consequences that come from the spread of mis and disinformation. My question is, how can we as consumers trust media corporations to accurately report information as it's happening in real time when it serves their interests financially to continue to support the harmful spread of this disinformation?
Let's hear from everyone on the panel about this, but Roxane Gay, you pulled your podcast also from Spotify for a similar reason.
I did. I think that misinformation is one of the deadliest issues that we're facing presently, because in the United States, a great many people, millions upon millions of people, decided to politicize masks and vaccines and choose to prolong the pandemic in ways that have been really consequential. And so to see someone like Joe Rogan get paid $200 million on Spotify to support quacks and idiots and racists, well, that's fine, free speech. But I choose who I do business with, and I'm certainly not going to do business with a company that thinks that's okay. And right now, the onus is upon us to educate ourselves and to make sure that we are seeking out accuracy. But what's really happening right now that's pernicious is that all of this misinformation and this disinformation is making people trust actually trustable news sources. And people are saying, oh, the war in Ukraine is fake news, when it's really not. And so if we don't take these stands now, we have no hope. And it's incredibly important that we hold companies accountable. And as consumers, the best way we can do that is by walking away with our money.
Do you agree, Prue?
Well, I think there's always been a tension between news gathering and entertainment. Charles Dickens, we go right back through newspapers, let alone television and Channel 9 and commercial television particularly, the need to make a buck, make it entertaining as well as newsworthy. But I agree, it's about the reputation of the news gatherer, and this is now just a much more crowded market, and that consumers have to be much better informed about who they trust. I would stay in with Spotify, otherwise that awful guy has won, and we've all lost. I absolutely, people are entitled to do what they want to do, but I would have stayed on that battlefield. I'd have kept telling the story with the facts and the truth that I thought people deserved to hear, or he's won.
Isabella, is it possible that over time you might actually regret losing your Spotify account and might want to go back?
I don't think so. I think that there is a moral and ethical responsibility on these corporations to make sure that the information they're feeding consumers who may not be as well informed as people who can look to alternate sources, this may be the only information they get, and I think that something really needs to happen there. I agree with free speech. I think it's incredibly important. I think it's essential. But I do think that there's a responsibility on those organisations to make sure the information is accurate.
But it's complicated. Yeah, I'll come to you in a second, Thomas. But it's complicated, isn't it, Roxane? Because I know you wrote in the editorial piece that I think published in the New York Times talking about you leaving Spotify, that you also disagree with, much of what the Rupert Murdoch's newspapers publish around the world. That causes you grief. You disagree with it. You see it as a form of disinformation in some respects, and yet you're staying publishing with a publisher that is owned by the Rupert Murdoch Corporation. So
Yes.
it ain't straightforward.
No, it absolutely isn't. And honestly, there's no such thing as ethical production or consumption in a capitalist economy. And so you
This
have...
just compromises the whole way.
It is. It really is. And, the thing is, I am still on the battlefield, even though my podcast isn't on Spotify, because it's available everywhere else that podcasts are available.
Right.
And
we're all doing advertising.
I think there are stances that are worth taking. And in terms of, Rupert Murdoch, it definitely, I'm published through HarperCollins in terms of my nonfiction, and it has served me very well. And I have a wonderful editor and a wonderful team behind me. And so I look at that and know, with Spotify, I didn't have any sort of personal connection.
Yeah.
My podcast is simply available there. And unfortunately, a significant number of my listeners did come from Spotify. But many of them have followed me, and I trust myself and what I have to offer to trust that people will understand my moral compass and go where it leads.
Thomas?
Yeah, I think that, harmful misinformation should be removed from those platforms. And Isabella, as a First Nations person, this is something that we live with all the time. I mean, the Murdoch media, I'll never forget the Australian, 2015, I think it was, the Bill Leak cartoon that showed an Aboriginal man facing a policeman that was holding a small Aboriginal boy by the scruff of the neck. The Aboriginal man's holding a beer and he's talking about responsibility to the Aboriginal man, and the Aboriginal man saying, yeah, all right, so what's his name? It was just disgusting. This sort of harmful misinformation is all through the media about First Nations people and who we are and how we live and how we love our children. And it's just absolutely, this sort of misinformation shouldn't be acceptable to any of us and how we spend our money.
You put together a collection of essays, of letters of fathers, Indigenous fathers to their sons, called Dear Son. Was that cartoon the catalyst for it?
It was just one catalyst of so many. I mean, even like the 2007 intervention was an absolute farce. It was millions and millions of dollars went into disempowering the most vulnerable Aboriginal people in communities. The army was turned against its own citizens in those communities and went in there. And a Prime Minister basically announced to the rest of the country that the issues, those social issues in those communities, was an Aboriginal problem, in complete ignorance of the harms that colonisation, of genocide or failed policies have done.
There were women in those communities, of course, who wanted to see some action taken to protect them and their children too. It was very, very complicated at the time to acknowledge their voices, but to do it in a way that didn't disempower everyone.
But if they had have listened to those women, they would not have had the intervention. I mean, the government suspended the Racial Discrimination Act to be able to do what they did. I don't think there's any Aboriginal woman that wanted that sort of measure. That was just, and we know today that it was built on a fabrication, and that it has not helped our people at all. It's taken us backwards.
Let me return to the questioner and Ali. It takes us to not only disinformation, of course, but to life on the net and what can be said and what's done. I know that you've been pretty viciously trolled over the years, personally, haven't you?
Oh, yeah, I think I'm probably one of the most trolled people in Parliament. Look, I think to an extent, misinformation and disinformation have always existed in some form or other, whether you called it propaganda and I don't think it's going to get any better. I think given the media environment that we have today, the fact is that people can choose what they want. There's a lot more choice. I think the key piece here is educating our young people to have a critical mind when they approach a text, to really look at the origins of that text and to be able to pick apart and analyse where there might be misinformation and disinformation, mistruths, where there are grey areas, where there is propaganda.
Teaching critical thinking is the thing.
Absolutely, we have to teach critical thinking, and I'm gunning here for the humanities and you know, really lifting the humanities the way that we teach the humanities at universities as well. I know that the Morrison government has really cut the humanities and undermined the humanities, but this is how you grow a generation of young people who are going to be able to deal with the challenges of a media environment where you can do so much, but misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, it is the way of the world now.
Yeah.
I just wanted to bring in a question from...
Can I just respond to that?
no, I want to bring this in first. We've got a question from someone who couldn't be here tonight. It's from Michael Perman in Peppermint Grove in WA. And I just thought it was really good to bring into this discussion. And I will come to you, Sarah Henderson. It says, has outrage become a recreational activity for a subsection of our society? And if so, does that outrage contribute to constructive conversation or does it stifle it? I just wonder if you've got a reflection on that, Roxane, because I know you've thought about this over, you know, that not everything is straightforward, and also that you can't always bring everyone on board with you, and nor should you even aim to. But has outrage become a recreational activity?
Of course not. You know, whenever people say that, what they're really saying is that I don't want to deal with the world as it is, and I don't want to be made uncomfortable by my own privilege. And so I'm going to just suggest that you enjoy outrage and not working towards solutions. But what outrage does is bring our attention to issues that we absolutely as a culture need to address. And of course, there are people who seem to thrive on outrage, who only talk about the things that outrage them and never go beyond that. But activists and people on the ground are generally going well beyond outrage. And when you look at the injustices in this world, anger is an entirely reasonable response to that. And so as long as those injustices exist, outrage will be there, and it should be there. And instead of looking at outrage as the end of the conversation, people need to look at outrage as the beginning.
I wanted to come to you, Sarah Henderson, about those proposed social media laws that I know that you back. They were announced by the government back in 2021 that would see social media companies crack down on and forced to reveal the identities of anonymous trolls. What's the status of that, and what do you imagine will happen with it?
Well, Virginia, I have to say I vehemently disagree with Anne in relation to misinformation and disinformation. Frankly, we need to do a lot more, and we are doing a lot more as a government to combat misinformation. I absolutely subscribe to free speech, but it is not absolute. And that is why we have taken
It's not what you guys were saying in 2016.
We've taken such strong action, whether it's on online safety, the e-Safety Commissioner, online privacy, and now looking at defamation online.
But
because
let me just stay with that, because I do want to get to some other questions. So rather than spending too long on it, what's the status of those laws? And I think they're in your committee right now, aren't they?
We're doing a bill inquiry, and there's also a separate select inquiry into broader issues of social media. Of course, the Online Safety Act came into force in January, and that's given the e-Safety Commissioner a whole range of much tougher powers, fines, takedowns and the like. And we're now going through the process. We've introduced a bill to make social media companies accountable for some of the dreadful defamation, some of the horrendous things that happen online. I mean, we heard from Sonia Ryan, the mother of a young 15-year-old who was murdered because of online trolling. This is a shocking, shocking situation, and we are taking it seriously. And I'm very, very proud of the work of our government in doing so.
I get that clearly. Roxane Gay, do you believe that laws like that are actually going to be workable with these sorts of companies we're talking about? A lot of them are fly-by-nighters. They're not all the Facebooks.
You know, I think that laws are only as powerful as the people who are willing to implement them. And in general, those people are more than willing to bend to Facebook, to Google, to YouTube, which is actually Google, to Twitter. And so I don't know. And I also think that those laws can be weaponized against people who are often the targets of online abuse. But something does need to be done when you look at what's happening online and the way in which people who are daring to speak up about human rights, who are daring to speak up about police brutality, who are daring to exist as a woman in the world. That level of harassment is breathtaking at times. It is incredibly cruel. It is pervasive, and oftentimes the more visible you become, it starts to bleed into your real life, where people find out your address and send you absolutely crazy things at your home. and at your job, and they call your job, or at least they call mine, and where is it going to stop? Because free speech cannot be a catch-all for every single thing that people want to say or do. And I don't know. There's no easy answer. Before
we move on, I just want to touch briefly on the column that you wrote, Prue, that became a bit of a sensation, where I think you were attempting to try. Well, I'll let you explain whether it was sarcasm about how the so-called proles are regarded and treated. It's kind of a little example of the pile-on that can occur, and then what you need to do as a writer to take account of it afterwards.
Well, you can never excuse bad writing, and it was bad writing, so there we go. But, I mean, I was really...
That's good of you to own it that way, I think.
I was really trying to make a very basic point, which is that, we need to respect and honour everybody in a way that I don't think we often do. I think that we classify people. I mean, let me give you an example of it. When I was minister, we reduced the number of children, Aboriginal children, we took into care by 42%. 42% in 2 years. Did we do that with some magic bullet, some wonderful program therapy? No. We changed the way caseworkers assess the risk of those children. In other words, the attitudes of caseworkers. And guess what? There's been no upswing in the number of child deaths. So it was about attitudes, because if it hadn't been, we'd have had an increase in Aboriginal deaths of children. But we haven't. So what that tells you is that the way we see each other and the way we treat each other and the assumptions we make about people who aren't like us are very dangerous. Did I write that very well? Obviously, clearly not. But is that what I was trying to say? Absolutely.
That's the column you need to write, Prue. That's the next one. Our next question is a video one. It comes from Libby Black.
This week, the Prime Minister issued branding for a women's forum that managed to unflatteringly depict women's bodies and include a phallus. He then reverse fat-shamed the Leader of the Opposition, somehow implying that Mr Albanese, by losing weight, was now inauthentic. I'm wondering, does the Liberal Party still have a women problem? And is this the kind of leadership that Australians can expect?
Sarah Henderson?
Well, firstly, on that logo, I agree. The Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, not the Prime Minister, not the Prime Minister's office, they had nothing to do with that logo.
Although they say, I'll just jump in there, they say the statement from the Prime Minister's office, I have to put this on the record, said that there was wide consultation about that logo, and yet neither the Prime Minister nor his office were consulted. So,
well, I'm just...
Wide consultation.
Well, the
PMC.
Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet is a very large department, and it does consult very widely. But just putting that on the record...
Let's have a look at the logo if you're missing it. We'll just show that for a second in case you missed this wonderful bit of design.
It looks like a gun.
What do you see, Roxane? When you look at that, what do you see?
I mean, who's drawing the dirty pictures? I don't see.
I do agree that that was very misplaced, and I'm very pleased that the department is going back to the drawing board.
Let's get to the serious point, though.
Can I just say, as a minister, as a former minister, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. You hire some wretched consultant who goes away and does all the consultations and comes up with all the... And they put them in front of you and you say, oh, I don't like that, it looks like phallus. No, Minister, you wouldn't know, we've consulted widely. And if you reject it, you're then, why are you challenging public service advice? And if you accept it, then it's your fault because you should have...
Are these designers men who are putting it in front of you? That's the question.
No, I'm just giving you an example that, I mean, when you're taking advice from so-called experts, it's very difficult to be able to distinguish between what you think. I mean, you look at it and you think that's rubbish, and you say it's rubbish, and the consultant and the public service department on the other side of the table says, oh, Minister, I don't think you understand how widely we consult.
Thomas, is that something you scrawled on a wall once when you were a naughty kid?
I suppose I did, yeah. But I just think it's laughable, like that this has even passed through. I mean, geez, it's just...
Am I missing something? It took me a while to figure out that it was a tiny little purple willy.
Well, I mean, there are so many things wrong with it. Like, it's literally...
I thought at first it was the W, and I'm like,
It is the W.
It is, but it's just bad. And also, anyone under the age of, say, 40 knows that purple, something of length, is the eggplant emoji.
Yes.
And
Oh, is that right?
This is true.
I mean, it's just tragic. And this is why diversity and inclusion matter, because clearly there were no black women in that room.
Yeah.
Maybe no women.
Yeah.
Well, that's very true. I mean, a woman in the room would have gone, if she didn't see, you know, dick and balls, sorry, are we after 9 o'clock yet? Would have seen boobs.
Frankenbeans.
Yeah, would have seen boobs and gone, that's equally as bad. Anyway, look, it was an absolute snafu, and so clearly they've gone back to the drawing board. But Libby's question also goes to this repeated issue of whether the government and the Prime Minister has a women's problem. Can I just read this to you, Sarah Henderson? So this is, well, let's play this. Let's have a listen to what the Prime Minister had to say at a town hall on Monday. This is one of the points that, that Libby's going to. Have a look.
I'm not pretending to be anyone else. We're still wearing the same glasses. And, sadly, the same suits. And I weigh about the same, and I don't mind a bit of Italian cake either. So I'm happy in my own skin, and I'm not pretending to be anyone else. And when you're Prime Minister, you can't pretend to be anyone else. You've got to know who you are.
So they're the comments that Libby Black's calling out, and of course that was his attempt to call out Mr Albanese's inauthentic. Just reading here, this is from your government's own National Men's Health Strategy, Sarah Henderson. The high levels of chronic conditions among men in Australia reinforces the need for an increasing focus on promoting healthy lifestyle choices and decreasing health risk factors, including smoking, overweight and obesity, physical inactivity and poor dietary choices, all of which are more prevalent in men than women. So is Anthony Albanese following the national guidelines better than the Prime Minister is?
Virginia, I would have no idea. I think
well, he just said that he wasn't.
To be very fair, I think the Prime Minister was making the point that in Anthony Albanese we don't see someone that we can trust as an authentic politician.
Well, he was trying to make that point via clothes and weight and glasses. So let's return to the question: is that the kind of leadership we can expect to see from your government?
Look, I think that's a bit of an unfair question, Virginia.
I don't think
the Prime Minister was really trying to say that a leopard doesn't change his or her spots. And we do know that Anthony Albanese has a track record of supporting high taxes on housing, on retirees.
We're segueing into we're segueing into a political rant that doesn't relate to the question.
No, I'm not ranting, but let me just make this point.
That's not what the question was, Sarah
Henderson. The Prime Minister was talking about authenticity and that he's not going to change who he is.
And that being overweight is authentic, was what he was saying.
Well, it is for him. He was talking about his own weight. I'm not going to talk about his weight or anyone's weight, frankly.
Even though he was speaking about Anthony Albanese.
But I think that was the point he was making.
Let's go to Anne Ali.
I just found it really distasteful. And, you know, the benefit of the doubt, it was an error of judgment. But I actually think that's more the Prime Minister's character, unfortunately. And I don't like it. And I don't think a lot of Australians like it, that when they see our leaders talking like that.
Do you think that sort of attempt at calling out what he clearly wants to be seen as inauthenticity, do you think that lands? Does that work, Thomas?
Not when you're being a hypocrite. I think that Scott Morrison is pretending to be a good Prime Minister.
What's the hypocrisy?
Well, the hypocrisy is that his government has failed in all sorts of things for so long. I mean, the hypocrisy is that he's a pretender, you know? I mean, he's pretending to care about Australians. He actually needs an empathy coach to be able to pretend well, and he's not doing it well.
I think that's really deeply offensive, Thomas. I mean, all of us...
It's not offensive, it's Thomas's view, and he's allowed... I want to go to Roxane.
No,
Roxane
I
Gay?
think it is offensive, because all of us...
let me hear from Roxane.
Just to say, all of us who go into politics and public life do it for the right reasons, and myself, everyone.
Okay.
And I just think that was probably not...
Well, he shouldn't attack Albanese's weight and what he
I think Thomas is allowed to criticise the Prime Minister. It's kind of why we're here. But
well, I'm allowed to say that it's offensive too.
Well, I don't know about offensive, but you may disagree.
You know, I think anytime you bring someone's body and their lives into public discourse for nefarious reasons, it just is a really sad reflection on your character or the lack thereof. And when politicians do it, it's really incredibly hypocritical because, I mean, many of them live wildly, supposedly unhealthy lifestyles, and then want to when it's convenient, start to point at one another and say, oh no, look, I'm still healthy. I like my Italian cake. And you know, why? Is that really going to help the people of Australia right now after 2 years of lockdown and a reeling economy and so many other issues? And of course, many countries around the world are dealing with this. But I think it's really challenging for everyday people to see their leader speak like this and insult another candidate and then think, this person has my best interests at heart.
Let's go to our next question. It's in the audience tonight and it comes from Nikita Trocheski.
Panel, as a young woman interested in politics, I can't help but feel discouraged by the often derogatory treatment of female politicians by colleagues and the media. What needs to be done to make Parliament a safe, harassment-free space for females?
Goward, we'll start with you on that.
Call it out. Just call it out. My generation didn't have the nerve. We were just so grateful to be anywhere. We put up with it. But I think this generation, there's more of them in Parliament, and they're younger. They've done everything the playbook said they had to do. They topped the state. They did maths. They became school captains. They worked for a charity. They've done everything that the feminist movement has said women can do and become leaders, and then they still have to deal with this rubbish at the end of the day. And it's got to be called out, and they've got to be supported when they're called out. And men know better. Men do know when to behave, because you notice who they don't say it to. So they've got to be reminded of that too. It's very bad manners. It is done intentionally to make them uncomfortable. I mean, I could tell you a million stories from both sides of politics. Nobody is pure on this about the way women get pushed around. And it's just to put us on the back foot. Well, we're there. We've had a female Prime Minister, we've had female ministers, we're ready to go, and it's time we just said, we're not taking it from you, thank you, and, you know, pull it in.
And Ali, is the mood changed enough we'll just stick with Parliament for a moment, in Parliament, because of women like Grace Tame and Brittany Higgins, that you might feel more comfortable about calling out, in fact, even feel empowered and angry enough to do it?
I think it's been really difficult for women in Parliament over this last year with everything that's come up with the Women's March. And you know your point earlier, Roxane, about outrage and, you know, outrage as a start. That really reminded me of all the issues that were really just bubbling at the surface and spilled over with the Women's March. I think in Parliament we do have these processes in place now, and processes go some way, and yes, we can call it out, but ultimately it's about changing behaviour, and it really is about holding perpetrators account for them to change their behaviour, because nothing will change if that behaviour, if you can call it out all you like,
yes, but
right, you can have all the process. They change. They have to take responsibility to change. The men who are perpetrating that behaviour need to take responsibility and change themselves.
But they won't if you don't tell them.
And they also won't if they're not held accountable for it.
Well, it's the same thing.
This question gets us to a very big issue that's running in Parliament at the moment about who may have been harassed, and that's or bullied or treated badly, and that's the late Kimberley Kitching. And Ali, your Labor Party is clearly leaking against itself at the moment in playing out the very bitter factional fight for survival that the late Kimberley Kitching and Bill Shorten's faction is in right now. Isn't that really at the heart of this issue, that it's also that, as well as bullying and mistreatment of Kimberley Kitching?
I think that, Virginia, you're right, it shouldn't be played out in this way, and it certainly shouldn't be played out in the media.
But that's what is in part going on here.
I know that's what is happening, and I think any claims of bullying or harassment need to be treated with the utmost confidentiality. And that, again, is the only way that you're going to get anything to work and any change if there is a process that is confidential. So, you know, we've lost a true champion in the Labor Party. I'll be at the funeral on Monday along with Labor colleagues honouring Kimberley's legacy and her record on human rights and the things that she really fought hard for. And it's a shame that before we've even laid her to rest, that we're having this conversation.
I want to turn to you, Sarah Henderson. I think Kimberly Kitching was a friend of yours. Is that right?
Look, she was a friend of a lot of people on our side of politics. And I'm, like many, very distressed and shocked by her death. She was a very young woman. She was a shining light of the Labor Party. And I'm also very distressed to read these stories that have been emerged in the last couple of days.
So do you think that her death is actually being weaponised by some in her faction who are fighting for their political survival? Is that what's going on here?
Look, I'm going to be very circumspect about what I say. Frankly, the people that matter the most at the moment are Andrew, her husband, and Kimberly's family. And so I don't want to add to their distress, and I don't want to add to their grief by discussing issues which are deeply, deeply distressing. But I do think, and I disagree with Anne, I don't think this should be shut down behind closed doors, and I think this does have to be called out. And if we can, I guess, look at what's happened to Kimberly and use this as a trigger to say, amongst us all, this is not good enough. We have to treat each other better. Our personal relationships between each other and who we deal with as members of Parliament are incredibly important. So let us shine a light on this. Let us call it out, change the law if we have to. And I mean, frankly, my view is every woman deserves to be safe at home, in the community, and in the workplace.
I just want to come back to Anne Ali.
I just want to address something there, Sarah, because I'm not saying it should be done behind closed doors, but if you've got a process in place for allegations of bullying or harassment, to deal with allegations of bullying or harassment, to ensure confidence in that process, they must be confidential. Because otherwise people are not going to come forward and say, I've been harassed or I've been abused or I've had this experience, if it's going to be played out on the national stage in the media. So it's not about saying, oh, brush it under the carpet and it's behind closed doors. It's about a process is in place and the integrity of that process relies on confidentiality.
But Kimberly did call it out. She did raise complaints, I understand, and nothing was done, Anne, and that's the problem.
That's what you're reading in the newspaper.
That's right. That's what I'm reading in the newspaper.
And that's my whole point.
That's where we're in the area of what's been leaked, what's been not able to be considered, and as you say, we're still. But I would like. We're still in the throes of actually, of her death and waiting for a funeral.
That's exactly right. But I would like to see leadership in the Labor Party and to see these issues seriously and properly addressed.
And in the same ways, there's been expectation that the issues that have been raised on your side of politics would be seriously addressed as well. So there's a lot of accounting to be done here. Our next question comes from Noah Atfee.
I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the rightful owners of the land upon which we gather, the First Nations people of the Eastern Kulin Nation. My question is for Thomas. Is our society normalised and numb to seeing injustice inflicted upon people of colour? With the recent acquittal of Northern Territory Police Officer Zachary Rolfe over the death of Kumanjai Walker, what do you think would have happened if the accused was a man of colour and the victim white?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think this whole country has been, it's not about normalising, this whole country has been built on the injustices to First Nations people and has just been, that's what Australia is right now. A complete injustice to First Nations people that have had their land stolen, that have suffered from genocide, forced assimilation, all of these things. And I got a call from a sister in a community near Yuendumu, a Gurindji woman, just the other night, after the acquittal of Rolfe. And there's genuine fear in our communities, in our families, that the same will happen to our young people, to our children. He should not have. I think the main thing here is that in the same week that Rolfe was acquitted, another First Nations man, another 19-year-old, was shot 6 times in Palmerston and tasered as well, and the police jumped all over him. And this is the sort of thing that we're seeing far too often. We've had over 500 deaths in custody now. over 500 deaths in custody, and not one of the families that have called for justice have received it. And I think it goes to the way that laws are made in this country, that the laws don't take into account the prejudice and the racism that we experience every day. The laws are made by mostly non-Indigenous men, mostly white men that have never experienced the racism that we experience. And it's one of the reasons why I think the Uluru Statement is so important. It calls for a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. And until we start to say what happens in our communities, until we start to have the influence on the laws to make sure that this is taken into account, then we're not going to see justice. Just one more thing is that if they just listen to the Warlpiri people, the Warlpiri elders in their community that have said, we want a ceasefire. We don't want guns in our communities, and I don't think there would be a need for guns in our community.
Do you think this incident will actually lead to a real meaningful discussion about that, about how guns are used or not used and deployed by NT police? Yeah, absolutely. It should be, the Warlpiri should be listened to, that the guns should be laid down, and they should listen to those communities about how justice can happen in our communities, how we can be cared for, you know, how we can heal. Because there would be no need for guns if we were treated with respect and if our lives really mattered. Roxane Gay, are there lessons, anything we can pick up here from the US experience, from the Black Lives Matter movement as well?
Well, I think that in the United States we're in the exact same situation where Black lives absolutely do not matter and police brutality continues unchecked. I live in Los Angeles part-time, and the police there have a lot of impunity when it comes to shooting unarmed people and armed people. They just ignore due process, and they don't value Black life, and there are no consequences. And so, you know, there is very little light at the end of that particular tunnel until we see a shift in power and an acknowledgement that the current system where the police are really given military-like powers, you know, and are allowed to shoot people in the back, which means someone is running away. You know, until we address that and address the racism underlying all of it, we're not really going to solve the issue in any way.
Let's turn to our final question of the night before we go to our live performance, which will be a great way to finish this evening. Our final question is a video, and it comes from Mike Griffiths.
How can we respect women when they are portrayed so poorly on shows like Love Island, The Bachelorette, Farmer Wants a Wife, and Married at First Sight?
All right, this is time for you to admit that you actually like watching some of this trash, Roxane.
Well, first of all, trash? No, we're talking about quality television. You know, the thing is, it doesn't matter how women behave. You deserve respect regardless. And so who cares what's going on Love Island? If you use that as a justification to degrade women, then that Love Island is not the problem. That is you looking for a justification for abhorrent behavior.
True confession, Sarah Henderson. Which of those shows have you watched?
All of them.
Good to know.
Look, I worked in television for a long time, including for Network 10, which was making Big Brother at the time. So I am aware that the producers often need to find a narrative with some of these shows. And I think many people who've been on these shows have said, I was really humiliated because the producers had to find a narrative. So I really have a lot of difficulty with that. They've got to be truthful and honest. And the fact of the matter is, I mean, Married at First Sight, there may be a lot of time when it's just, you know, boring television. But I do not like the idea that these stories are misconstrued, that women in particular are mischaracterised to try and deliver some spicy television. And so I do think that these television programs need to take greater responsibility.
Okay. Thomas, you watched any of it?
I don't watch those shows. So, I'm a bit boring like that, I suppose. I prefer to read and, you know, work, and I don't watch them.
Honestly, Thomas, what are you going to say about you? Prue Goward.
I've seen the shorts when I've been watching the tennis, but no.
For those the women who turn up for those shows, do they deserve our respect?
Yes,
as the questioner asked.
Yes. I mean, look, it's just silly entertainment, but you know we've got bigger issues to worry about.
And Ali?
No judgment, but yeah, I watch all of them. And how about maths last night? Stop, we need to talk about that. But yeah, I do watch all of them. But I'm 100%, I could not have said it better than Roxane. Yeah, how can you respect women like that? Well, you're responsible for respecting women. So it's,
correct.
It's not their behaviour, it's your response.
So So back on you. And that's all we have time for. Please thank our panel, Roxane Gay, Sarah Henderson, Thomas Mayer, Prue Goward and Anne Ali.